DC, and we were able to do a micro study based on our initial outreach. They in turn worked with the Department of Health and went on to test from our 40 home micro study post our initial outreach after the storms to a 400 home CDC study focused on Legionella disease and impacts. Next slide, please. So we also deploy rain gauges and weather stations. We are on generation 6 and 7. We're attaching to wireless technology. This is one of the earlier additions. This is on a home in St. John. Next slide, please. And that helps us work with the U.S. drought monitors. We not only engage the farmers, the youth, the teachers, the community at large, we also work with USGS, EPA, the Climate Hub, USDA, drought monitors, Farm Service Agency, NOAA, National Weather Service, and NIDIS, among others. In part of my work, I actually buy expensive tools for our farming community. As you notice, the photo on the right is from 2019 to the present. This is an indicator of drought. This is extreme soil cracking in St. Croix. On the upper left, you'll see a pond that has not been full since 2015. On the lower left, you'll see a dried pond in St. Croix. Next slide, please. We deploy drones to our farmers who become reporters for our drought report. And this is a copy of just a screenshot of the drought report. I'm really proud of the Climate Hub and my colleagues there, as well as all of our colleagues. As you can see their logos up top. I'm one of the key writers for the Virgin Islands, and we really work significantly with our farming community across the territory in order to garner sector impacts and those drone images so that we can inform the drought monitors of what's happening on the ground in the Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico in real time. Next slide, please. So this is my project that I'm working on today. This is a project I'm working on with EPA. It looks like a hot mess, but it's just an example of the Virgin Islands. You can see St. Thomas on one side, St. John on the other, and the beautiful island of St. Croix, which is where I am now. We were trying to do 100 cistern tests for E. coli and Tococci, as well as human DNA. I'm actually doing that now. I'm in the field. And so always working to work with our federal and local partners, our community groups. This is done in a pod. And it's really exciting to get a baseline before the storm season so that we can come back in October and do it again to determine what is happening in real time. Next slide, please. So this is part of the work that we're describing. So we're using a poll, we're talking with homeowners, we're collecting data, we're actually drawing directly from the cistern so that we can find out if there is septic seepage in our cisterns. And it's been a really great project. So far, we're at about 70 samples times 2. E. coli and Endococci is one system, and then the human DNA will be filtered 3 times, frozen, and sent to New Jersey. So it's about 140 samples that I'm at right now in 2 weeks. Next slide, please. So these are our students from UVI and Iowa State Earth Program working with us in the lab to do all of the lab components to ensure that we have a scientific method that is approved by EPA so that we can do this properly, correctly, and report the outcomes back not only to the community at large, but to our partner agencies. Next slide, please. We are deploying drought-tolerant fruit in our community. These are dragon fruit. They sell for approximately $25 to $45 a pound if you export to Europe. This is an example of a fruit that is high-end, easy to grow, is water tolerant or drought tolerant, so it requires very little water and is very simple to grow. We put out 1,511 pieces of pitaya across 3 islands in 2 months. Next slide, please. This is me with my colleague and farmer, Mr. Creaky on the right, and this is me in St. Croix. Apologies for the big arm spread, but this was an undertaking. A private foundation donated $50,000. I am on my 2nd year of buying, so in a 1-year cycle from 2021 to 2022, I will have 2,000 fruit trees, mangoes, avocados, 16 different types of avocado, 13 different types of mango. I'm bringing in rambutan from Martex Farms out of Puerto Rico. We're also bringing in drought tolerant and dwarf plantain from Puerto Rico. This is part of our food security component. As you know, extreme weather impacts food security. So you've got issues with water, you've got issues with food, and as an environmental justice project, we're trying to create awareness and increase science literacy. Next slide, please. This is a water demand study with USGS. This is engaging on the farms, so we know how much water is used and when. Next slide, please. And the key takeaways of my presentation are climate effects impact health and food security. It's obviously an existing, but there are new threats to climate change, which means that there are new and arising health impacts. To combat it, we're planting fruit trees and working on methods to conserve as we work to create the next generation of STEM professionals. We're working to create a robust environmental monitoring program that provides the public and those who research air, water, and soil with tools, data, and collaborations that benefit our community and the Eastern Caribbean region. A lot of this work would not be done without the heroes, which are all of the ambassadors from the farmers, the youth, the teachers, the community at large, and our federal and local partners, along with our community and NGOs. My name is Christina Chanas. I'm with the College of Science and Math. I'm an extension agent, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Christina, for sharing those great examples on the so much positive outcomes that come when doing participatory and community-based works and projects. Now we're going to pass the mic to Mariolga Reyes Cruz. Es una psicóloga comunitaria.
She's a community psychologist and director of 2 documentaries that have been nominated for the Emmy, and she is an activist in terms of social justice, and she has published her work in terms of democratic participation and community, and she has participated in several publications. Mariolga is co-founder and director of the Community Land Trust for Sustainable Agriculture, and she works to ensure complete access to land, working lands, and to ensure food sovereignty that we certainly need in Puerto Rico. Welcome, Mariolga, and you have the microphone. Hello, everyone, and thank you for this invitation. I am going to share a brief presentation. So this is a distant overview. And here we have the presentation, and the idea is to talk briefly about how we can look the food sovereignty and climate justice from the common assets. And first of all, we need to be aware and acknowledge that I suppose that we all here we have in mind, and we are very aware, but I think it is important to take it as a starting point for this conversation. It is that the climate crisis is a social political crisis. It has consequences in the ecosystems, and it is created by human activity, particularly for the way that we are thinking about the well-being, development, and progress. And these looks, we still have them, and they are present in the public policy in our country, in Puerto Rico, and all over the world, literally. The global warming is being exacerbated by the industrial revolution. And we need to keep that in mind when we are facing the different crises that we are facing within the climate crisis. So that mindset of industrial development, it creates what we used to call the externalities, but these are the crises that are facing the most vulnerable, and we are not benefiting from that development, and that includes the ecosystems that we depend on. So from this point of view, I would like to let you know that we need actions that lead us to climate justice. So we need to acknowledge that there are physical limits, including territories that we inhabit, our islands where we live, and our bodies. To continue with this idea that we may continue to aspire to an endless economic growth, it's exactly what is depleting the natural systems, and that people who are living this injustice and oppression are the ones that are suffering this climate crisis the hardest. So the actions that we take need to reflect the urgency of the moment. We need to recognize the interconnectedness of all these elements in the different systems, and we need to recognize that the responsibility for the crisis should rest in those who are more responsible for generating the global warming. So it is important that we as individuals in our daily life that we need to be having a sustainable life in terms of recognizing that we live in a limited planet and we need to establish a different relationship with the earth. But that doesn't mean that deciding if we are going to use a straw is going to affect the global warming. So we need to adjudicate responsibilities where it applies, and we need to support solutions that are sustainable, just and equitable for next generations. So we need to think long term ahead, what we are doing today, and it is going to affect the future generations. So in that sense, we have a specific example of what I have been working on from different points of view as a documentarist and also as an artist, and more recently as a co-founder of the Community Land Trust for Sustainable Agriculture. And it is a topic of food sovereignty. And we talk about these concepts, and sometimes we use them as if they meant the same thing. But I would like to clarify that in terms of the discussion of public policy and the social movement, there are differences that we need to clarify. Food security is focused on the access to enough food, and that is key. In the terms of Puerto Rico, we know that a third of the population already lives through food insecurity, and we are a territory that is highly dependable on importations. And when the food doesn't come to the port, there is no food. So this is an experience that we share broadly and more recently with Hurricanes Irma and Maria, but it is an experience that we live day to day in our communities in the archipelagos, especially in the islands of Vieques and Culebra, where finding empty shelves is a daily event. So the food sovereignty talks about different things. It is talking about food as a right to have a culturally appropriate food, healthy, ecologically harvested food, sustainable, and also that we make decisions about what we are planting and the reason why it is being planted. And food sovereignty is highlighting the planting for local consumption in a way that we are not using more carbon and we generate local and regional economies. And I highlight this aspect because the issue of the way that the systems are interconnected, we can see it precisely in the subject of food security and sovereignty. If we continue highlighting agriculture for exportation and the policies to support this kind of agriculture are thought from the logic of mono planting, we are increasing carbon emissions, we are affecting the climate, we are not generating local economies and we don't have any food available. So one of the responses that we have, that we are working on in Puerto Rico, is precisely what do we need in order to drive the food security? And among the many elements that are required to achieve this, maybe the most important is the access to the land, equitable access to the land, and in a way that we may protect the land permanently. And in that sense, we are recognizing that for more than 200 years, we have been creating a relationship with the land that is not sustainable. We depend on the land, and what we find in the land are the natural systems. They are not being regenerated in the same time that we are destroying them. On the contrary, it takes decades and sometimes centuries or millennials. And in that sense, we need to rethink the land as a common asset. It is a common asset. It is a resource that is necessary for the community, and that community manage the resource and using some rules and negotiations that are created by the community so that resource may be managed sustainability for the future use. And in that sense, the common assets are a distributional system, and we are looking to ensure that everybody has fair share either to the resource itself or to the product arising from that land. And also that the system, the way we relate to the system, it is thought long-term. So we think long-term in terms of the resource because we put the value of the use. In terms of the land, we want to make sure that we can be here and that we can be here long-term. And in order to do that, one of the issues that we need to talk about is the working lands. We need to take them out of the real estate because that is a threat because of the pressure of the speculation. One of the mechanisms to achieve this is through the land trust, community land trust. And in Puerto Rico, we have 3 community land trusts. FiTiCAS is the first one, and it addresses specifically the subject of protecting and the access to farmland. And what we do is precisely looking for a way, alternative ways to protect the land in the long term, so the farmers who are ecological farmers could have the land and it doesn't have a property or initial capital. So this uses among the farmers who barely earn $20,000 a year. So part of the issue is recognizes that they are inserted in a food system that is very complex and that it is structured based on the debt. And in order to develop a sustainable agriculture, we need to lead with this market, the real estate market, as well as the food market and employment market. So we are working with landowners that reflects their values and their principles on what we do, and with agricultures that need security in the land ownership, and that they can see themselves in a horizon where the land and the housing are common. So the people who are living in the community land trust are participating in the governance structures and the decisions that affect them. So from this point of view, what we are establishing is that there is a different possible future. As some people mentioned, they are possible if people come together. And in that sense, we need to reimagine different possibilities and work on them. Thank you very much, Mariolga, and thank you for bringing these contrasting concepts and the importance of the land trust to ensure access and food production in our island.
Sibily-Brown, I'm gonna spotlight you, Sommer. Sommer is a local food systems development advocate in the U.S. Virgin Islands. She is the founder and executive director of the Virgin Islands Good Food Coalition. Her organization seeks to raise awareness about the importance and impact of a healthy local food system in the territory. And her vision is to support the development of a thriving and just food system in the Virgin Islands that prioritizes local food producers, local businesses, and local consumers to create a sustainable network. So welcome, Sommer, and the mic is yours.
Hello, 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 everyone. Please forgive my raspy voice. I had laryngitis last week, so it's just coming back. It is such an honor to be on this panel and to be here at this conference. I want to invite us to take a breath. Close your eyes and take a meaningful deep breath, pulling up from the earth, from the sole of your feet to the crown of your head, filling your lungs and release. The air we breathe is a critical, unseen part of our environment that we take for granted every day. That air that produces oxygen, CO2, all of the gases that go into producing a healthy fruit. I'm here to talk to you about secure, sovereign, sustainable. What are the intersections of food, the environment, and justice? I deliberately chose, I had a PowerPoint, I was like, we've been talking at screens all day. I'm hoping in our little 4 frames, squares, we can find a way to genuinely be together and you can find a way to connect to your ancestral legacy of food, to your identity, to your sense of place, where you were born, where you live, where you are pulling energy from, where you contribute to, and who we are leaving it for. Mariolga eloquently described the difference between food security and food sovereignty, one of them being of access and one of them being of choice, right? And you ask yourself, well, what is the role environment plays in me talking about having access to food and having choice about food, having choice about what is on my plate, who is controlling what we eat? And what does that have to do with our nationality? What does that have to do with our colonial status? What does that have to do with our race, with our gender, with our sexual identity, with our economic status, with our educational status, with our abilities, right? How does that come into play in food? And I want to share a scenario that happened here where I live, but we can turn it over to 10 scenarios probably in Puerto Rico, but I live on the island where it rained oil, right? Last year in 2021, it rained oil. And we as a people quickly, especially the impacted people, quickly understood the limits and the magnitude of their voice, right? People asking and screaming out and saying they wanted to be able to breathe. Farmers, most of our farms and food being planted and harvested in the area where it was affected. And there was a ceiling. There was this, our voices could only go so high. Even when we had the opportunity to interact and be supported by the highest places in our land, you know, like the people who are over this, Environmental Protection Agency, ATDSR, like all of these people who did come to support, there was still a limit. There was still a limit in how quickly help could be received and how we got to control what that help was, how people were served. So we're looking now at farms that lay westward that were impacted by rain, oil, gas releases, and food still being grown. And people, farmers still having to sell that food, not knowing, not having access to resources for us determining how the land was impacted quickly, how the water was impacted quickly, who would then buy, sell, and eat that food, what the overtime impact would be to their bodies, right? We can see that in the wake of a disaster in Puerto Rico and flooding, when we're talking about earthquakes, stormwater, all the things that happen to our small territories where we do not control the response, no matter how loud our voice gets. And that response and the answer is predicated by people who don't live here, who don't understand the context of our everyday, and we still have to wait for those decisions. So food, environment, justice, health, economics, they all come into play. They're all intersectional, and we have to begin to look at them as not separate. One of the things that I think I bring to the panel, which is quite unique, is I'm not a scientist, right? I am, if we all took off our professional tags, whatever they may be, right? I get to say I'm the executive director of an organization which I founded. That could very much be true. But these conversations about food and environment need to be managed within our humanity, right? Because if we're all the people who are interested, right? And this conference, there is a lot of exchange of information that is common amongst us, because this is our career fields, because this is our interest, because you are keen and understand the climate. My question is, who is missing from this table that needs to be a part of the conversation to clarify what are the exact intersections of food, environment, and justice, right? For an example, we are in the Virgin Islands. What we have seen is the loss of local fruit, right? Local food and fruit trees. So when we're talking about mispel, when we're talking about mami, when we're talking about sugar apple, when we're talking about guava, right? Those are things that were ancestrally accustomed to be on this place, that contributed to the soil in a specific way, that made up the biodiversity that we are accustomed to because of large-scale development, right? Monocrop agriculture, industry, large industry, and not having the proper land and water use plans. Again, as Mariolga, she talked about what are the long-term indicators, right? What is the long game for how we develop? What is the long game for how we use water? What is the long game for the trees, the fruit, the food that we're planting and consuming? Without those things, things remain inaccessible. Our food identity remains hidden. Our future seems uncontrollable because we have not, as a people, everyday citizens, all been invited to the table to develop shared language and to have conversations in the commons, right? I am so glad Mariolga went before me, because she gave such a great platform as she talked about the commons. Now I want to talk about common language as an answer to food, environment, and justice. How we speak the same language with more people to get them at the table to discern how are they impacted, right? We don't know, we have assumptions about how people experience in the US territories the injustice of lack of access to food, the injustice of the things that are happening in their environment. We actually need to begin to document those things in the ways that people can language for themselves. There are many people whose voices are invisible. And so in this process of becoming secure, having access, every household having access to nutritional food, and all of the time, sovereign, having the choice to grow the food, to eat the food that we identify sustainable, knowing that the practices used to grow that food are adding to not climate action in a negative way, but in response. And then looking at all of the identities that each one of us as a citizen in these territories have and how we are shifting power within that, that's a conversation for the entire US Caribbean to participate in. I look forward to talking with the rest of my panelists in the remainder of this conversation. I hope something I said was helpful. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you so much, Sommer. Thank you for letting us know the importance of intersecting food, environment, and justice through that storytelling, and for underscoring that there are people missing in the table, and that we need to be aware of that and see how, through our privilege, we give the space that they deserve. Now we're going to pass the mic to our last panelist.
Hola.
Uriyoán is a professor in the Department of Global Health at George Washington University. Her work focuses on understanding the role of social and structural determinants of food and diet outcomes among populations in Latin America, the Caribbean, and minority populations in the United States. Uri's work has informed several programs and policies in the US and Latin America, and has used participatory approaches to bring diverse perspectives into the research process. She is also the director of Water Up, Agua Vida, a multi-sector project to reduce the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverage among Latinos. The mic is yours, Uri. Thank you.
I'm here, I study nutrition, and what I'm gonna be presenting today is really just probably numbers to what you already know about the reality of our territories and the lived experiences. And I'm gonna try to be linking it to disasters. I got interested in nutrition and disasters after Hurricane Maria, and seeing what my parents had received in terms of the foods and what was available to them. And so I wanted to call a little bit of attention to that. The fact that we all know that disasters break the food systems, they break all the systems, and the food systems is one of them. And leading to how Mariolga was talking about a fragile food system, more likelihood of it being broken. But I want to just provide more emphasis on the health and nutrition aspect of that, so that we can better prepare, and we can, at least, maybe we don't know the answers to the questions, we can at least start asking these questions and asking about different possibilities. It is in line with this question of nutrition security that USDA just last month elevated. Nutrition has always been part of food security definition, but in practice, maybe we don't always think about nutrition. We think about having access to food, having access to calories. But now that we are thinking about the diet-related chronic diseases that our pueblos, our communities are disproportionately suffering, then nutrition becomes that almost like a pivotal intervention point from which everything else, morbidity, mortality, diseases break through. And so here's the way that nutrition security is defined by USDA as of last month. There's a big emphasis on these three different pillars of food security: dietary quality, so not just getting enough foods, but the type of foods that we're getting that actually improve our health. And this question of equity, a lot of emphasis on disproportionate access, and how do we find nutrition equity? How do we leverage that aspect of dietary quality for communities that historically have been structurally marginalized, socioeconomically not as advantaged as other communities. And so tying it back to disasters, this is very important because just to give you, because people, the way that people react in disasters and the way that people experience, as we all know from lived experiences, the way that we experience and relate to food during disasters, especially from the territories. These are results from a study that the Instituto Nueva Escuela in Puerto Rico carried out, and I assisted them looking at food security using USDA food security measures in not representative of all of Puerto Rico, but we had 1,300 respondents, so not a small number. Before the onset of the pandemic, 38% of that sample reported that they experienced food insecurity, and that increased to 40% since the pandemic. And specifically suffering from fear about the food that they bought not yielding enough, and they did not have enough money to buy more. And behaviors that restricted that. Did any adult in the household stop eating due to lack of money or food? Yes, since COVID, 20% of that sample said yes. So these anxieties and fears that the food is not going to be enough is something that we feel very densely. This is a global phenomenon, but it is particularly acutely felt in Puerto Rico, and I'm sure in the other territories, because of the fragility and of the food system, and because of the previous experiences since the hurricanes, etc., where the food system was completely disrupted. So there is a lot of anxiety affecting how people react to food. And I wanted to show this to provide more deeper understanding of what that means. These are examples that we also report from the United Nations questions about anxiety related to food. And you can see that since the pandemic, 98% were more aware of food being wasted, which may, in terms of crisis, there are always opportunities. So this could be an opportunity for Puerto Rico, but also hoarding more foods, eating more due to fear of anxiety, buying more food due to fear or anxiety, etc. So all of these increased, including relying on government assistance programs. With that sample of 1,300 participants, we also ran some predictive models to understand what were the characteristics that were associated with the risk of being food insecure or being food secure. And what we found really here, what's interesting is these two that I have first highlighted here, that there are different behaviors. The houses that are food secure are in their nutrition behaviors inherently different from the houses that are food insecure. So you can see that having more availability at home of fruits, fresh and frozen fruits, was protective against food insecurity, is what this number tells us. Whereas having fruit-flavored drinks are drinks that are made with fruit flavor, but that have a lot of added sugar. They're actually a very known risk factor for diabetes, hypertension, and other chronic diseases. And so houses that were food insecure, houses who bought fruit-flavored drinks, more fruit-flavored drinks since the pandemic, tended to be more food insecure. And so we don't understand the relationships of why this was not a causal type of analysis, but it provides an important insight into how the houses are behaving. And it is important to understand that and to document that with numbers along with the stories that we already know, so that we can then think about policies that might be supporting those behaviors in one way or another, or facilitating unhealthy behaviors, or facilitating healthy behaviors on the other hand. Again, these were variables that were very specific to the household, not outside of it. But more importantly, I think it is, looking outside of the house, how are households being supported in their nutrition security is also something that, especially with climate change, with the increases in frequency and intensity of the consequences of climate change that we're expected to see, we have to pay more careful attention to. And we have to start communicating that nutrition is really not a luxury. You can see here that 1 month after Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico, the transportation had been restored, but at the beginning, everything was destroyed in terms of some roads and ability to transport foods. There was no power when we did this particular study after Hurricane Maria. But this is a month after Hurricane Maria, and the first foods that were ordered by retail, of course, were shelf-stable foods, and these tended to be snacks, candies, and sodas. This was after the bottling companies were ordered to transport, to bottle just water and transport water. We didn't find any availability of water, of diet drinks, of milk, of 100% fruit juice, but we did find plenty of availability of snacks and candies, which tend to be, of course, they're shelf stable and they tend to be high in sodium, added sugars, and saturated fats. And so I'm thinking about how the response works and how we work with the environmental side of the home to support the home is very important also to document that. And it is important because there is higher prevalence of chronic diseases, as we all know. In Puerto Rico and in US Virgin Islands, in these populations where we need to pay more attention to what they have, whether they're able to make that choice or not, whether that is actually their choice or a choice that is being made for them by the structures and the history of it. So you can see here, Puerto Rico versus the United States. What really struck me when we were doing these analyses is the reaction to nutrition and in how we think about nutrition in terms of whether it's a luxury or not, whether it's a right or a luxury, and whether it's realistic to expect responses from the federal government, from our local governments, and from populations to eat more healthfully. And when we did this analysis of the boxes that were provided after Hurricane Maria from the federal agencies, we did this in Barranquitas, which is a mountainous town in Puerto Rico, in the middle of Puerto Rico. We saw that 50% of those foods that were provided exceeded the upper limit recommendations of added sugar, sodium, saturated fats. And they really were bombarding then an environment where there was no power. They were already shelf-stable foods, already full of snacks, candies, sodas, and things like that. So it's not like they needed more of these kinds of calories. On the other hand, that also means that the other 50% did comply. So it is possible to provide shelf-stable foods during these emergencies that do comply with the dietary guidelines for Puerto Rico and for Americans in a better way. And understanding how to best provide those calories while addressing those dietary quality, especially in populations in our communities, in our pueblos, has become increasingly important. And I just invite the audience and thank the other panelists to think about, as we're thinking, I have a colleague, Alberto Rodríguez, who's sent me this, and then he wrote an op-ed about the recent apagón, which the power loss that Puerto Rico had last week, and the loss of food. And all of that is related, whether you want it or not, eventually with what we have the choice, which is really not a choice, of eating. How do we improve that choice? And it has implications for mortality and morbidity that we are probably not seeing in terms of studies and policies as clearly as we should. So thank you again very much. Sorry for the snafu with the presentation. I'll stop sharing. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Uri. Thank you for sharing that data. It's so important because we know that there's somewhat in a scarcity of data on those concepts and issues here in Puerto Rico and in the region. We have 10 minutes, well, no, like 5 minutes for some questions. There's been an interesting conversation in the chat, but I know, Christina, are you there? I'm gonna read as I have them in order. So Christina, if do you happen to know if water security has been, do you know if water security has been measured in the US Virgin Islands?
We're working on that. We're working on a micro water demand study with USGS. So we're putting data loggers and on lines on pumps in farms so that we can determine what the agricultural water use is. It's about 18 farms across 3 islands. We're also getting ready to do a well study. USGS only has 3 groundwater sensors, and those are monitored at one each island. And then in addition, we'll be working with homeowners on timers and meters to determine what their usage is. So those are micro components. Primarily what I do is do a micro project prior to writing a grant. That way I have baseline data. So we are endeavoring in that area, but funding, as always, is difficult. And oftentimes agencies will want to fund for a year or two, up to 3 years. And it's not enough time to do an accurate study. 3 to 5 years gives you that baseline, but oftentimes the funding agency doesn't want to fund up to that component. So you're always chasing a new shiny penny.
Thank you. I don't know if Mariolga or some of the panelists wanna talk a little bit about the questions who Santiago, Roger, Rudy are making regarding solar farms or the use of the land use in regards to energy use and how creating that balance of agriculture and energy production. I don't know if Mariolga wants to comment.
Hi, yeah, briefly, I mean, we can do many things. I think the main question is what we should do at this moment and how what we do now affects the possibilities for the next generations. Those are not easy questions to ask. I think in some respects, we need to slow down to be able to think through things intersectionally and transversely. I think I just made up a word, transversalmente. And I'm saying that because there are some things that will take time for us to figure out. And if we take that time without creating more harm to nature and communities, we should do that. That's one thing. And the other is someone at the last comment is asking, Daniel Whittle is asking, what are the biggest constraints to food security and sovereignty in Puerto Rico? I want to escape the logic of the thing or the number one thing, because it forces us to ignore that we're talking about complex systems, and that if we can, I'm a community psychologist by training, and one of the things that we looked at is how the conditions that we want to change are the result of historical and multiple factors. And we need to acknowledge that, because if we don't, we continue spending a lot of energy and resources in trying to find very simple solutions that help maybe today a few people, but do not change the systems that create the conditions that we're suffering. So in that sense, the CLT, the FiTiCAS in particular, is trying to address some of the issues, and knowing that we need to work collaboratively in an ecosystem of organizations that are doing different things that all are needed, all now, all at the same time, to create the conditions for food sovereignty. And that's the topic for many, many more panels and conversations. So I'm gonna leave it
Thank
there.
you. Sommer, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to, one, thank Mariolga and all the other panelists for naming the things they named so well, and how I wish I could have a conversation off camera with you all to tap into your brilliance. But the point that Mariolga just made about the complexity of the issue, right? The answer to complexity is diversity. We need to do this. The reason why slowing down is important, and not ignoring current issues, but we cannot create these solutions in a vacuum outside of community wisdom, outside of bringing them along and understanding their needs and their desires for how we're shaping it. A large impactor to environment is how I live my life every day. So we can do all the science we want in a room and create all these systems. If people don't understand how to use them, how to participate them, and they don't represent the values of everyday people, our answers will fall on deaf ears and we will be having this conversation again. So it's like, how do we strike the balance of addressing the urgency, but not creating a gap in the collective intelligence to the application of the solutions that we have?
Can I add to that, just building up on what
Yes.
Sommer said? I don't think we're going to lose our seat at the table just because we're taking it slow and being mindful about what needs to be done. That's actually disempowering in a way. I think we need to take our time and actually increase the seat at the table, actually keep hold of that table. Otherwise, we'll put a Band-Aid to it and be like, oh, no, they're already working on this. And until the next 5 years or 10 years when it explodes somewhere else because it was a Band-Aid approach.
Thank you so much. I want to keep the conversation ongoing. In my take to the comments on the technology and solar farms, Roger, who are speaking, I think when we think of technology, we need to be slow and think of the unintended consequences and also the context in which that technology is being used. What can work in one place may not work in another, and think of that technology in the context where we are proposing and in the feasibility. In the case of Puerto Rico, we know we have tons of roof and we have land, for example, that is polluted, thousands of acres, Peñuela, Guayanilla, that maybe can be used for that type of technology. But yes, taking it slow and seeing what it's, the knowledge that is being already produced before proposing one type of technology or the other. So Christina, you have your hand up, and after your comment, we will finish the panel.
Okay, and I respect everything that my colleagues have indicated, and I agree. But I think it's a cross section of both. I think you need to slow down for the messaging and the engagement, because you want people to accept and understand and participate. But in the Virgin Islands, particularly, we've been in drought since 2015. And we're not getting any more water. So if you don't have water, you don't have food. If your soil's contaminated, then you can't grow food. If your air is polluted, you can't breathe, you can't grow food. If there's pollution in our air, it's going into our water sources. And if there's pollution in our air and our soil, then it's eventually ending up in our sea, which is our food source. So I think we need to be calculated. We need to collaborate, we need to work closer together, and we need to work cross disciplines. And as somebody who does that on a regular basis, it's not popular and it's not easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. And so to all of my colleagues, I want to thank you for your awesome opinions. And I want to work with you to create a better, stronger insular community for all of the territories. Whatever happens is going to happen to us first, and it's not going to be pretty. So everything that we know collectively and we share can help everyone else in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Oh, Mariolga, few minutes, seconds.
Yeah, I just want to add, I just threw that out there without any nuance, but I just want to say that what I mean by slowing down, it's that I see, at least in Puerto Rico, talks about billions of dollars in infrastructure that that are pretended to, just be solutions that are pushed forward without the time of listening to different kinds of knowledges on how those investments are going to affect present and future. And in that sense, I think that there is a need for some slowing down so that we can better invest the resources, the public resources, so that we can create the possibilities of the present and the future, from who is hired to do the jobs to where the infrastructure is set and what the immediate and long-term consequences of that infrastructure are. Like, we can think of how to deal with coastal erosion, how to deal with droughts, how to deal with the access to energy. And there are many and many issues. So here, the speediness goes against public participation and analysis of the knowledge that we already have. I don't mean like we need to wait for all the studies to be done, because we're never gonna end, right? Science continues to learn in the process. But there are some things that have to slow down so that we can actually make decisions based on the knowledges that we currently have, and an assessment of how these projects impact present and future. That's what I mean. But obviously there are immediate needs that need to be attended, and there is no way around that. So the issues of drought, for example, we are suffering from that as well. Farmers are suffering from that, and there needs to be an immediate reaction to that. But the question is, what kind, right? And at what cost, and who is going to benefit? So we need the time to ask those questions and talk about them.
Thank you so much, Mariolga. Gracias. Gracias, Uri. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Sommer. I think all of this conversation is evidence of how rich can it be when we bring different elements, structural elements, social, environment, and intersect them when we talk about food security and all issues around food and the environment. So thank you all very much. Muchas gracias a las panelistas. And so have a great rest of your afternoon.